this Telstra one or the iNet one?
Telstra, and then that's the password. Sorry, we're just getting connected.
Yes.
Yeah, g'day. Yeah, we're just getting connected, and Robyn Ferrell and I are having a little mini seminar over here. So it's, you know, something. We're still socially distanced. We're about 1.5 metres apart, but she's in the same room as me, and she's just getting connected up to the Wi-Fi. So that's why we don't have Robyn yet, but we will very soon.
Yeah, you could always angle your camera, and
so we could do that. I mean, I did think for a while we would both be on the same screen, and we could certainly do that, but it's probably just a little bit easier, isn't it, Robyn?
It
We're
is,
on too.
because I wanted to read.
Robyn wants to read,
yeah.
So if we can hang on for a minute or two.
Just give me 2 seconds and I'll find the link. Where were we?
Oh yeah.
The Institute, got it here.
Have you got it?
Got it.
Such an extraordinary sign of the times that it just seems, you know, this amazing intimacy, you know. This
no, that's right. I can actively see it.
Together.
I've made her a cup of coffee, and I offered her a biscuit, but she said no.
So start video. Yeah, there I am. Great. And
let's just have a look there.
Audio.
Oh, look, there's Robyn. Yeah. And
can you hear me as well?
Yes, we can, Robyn. Yeah.
Great. There's a bit.
No, it's okay. Try now.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep, clear now as well.
Just only one of us should have our microphone on.
Okay, great. Oh, I see. So you've muted yours.
Yeah,
brilliant. Okay. And so I'll just call up the text as well.
And, so Lorenzo is going to chair.
Great.
I see myself as coordinating.
Good.
No chairing.
Oh, not chairing. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Facilitating.
Yeah. That's what we need. Facilitation. Yeah.
I wouldn't say moderating because I'd rather radicalize instead.
Exactly. I was going to say it needs no moderation. No, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So if you guys agree, I'd like to get going. We have all our presenters are here. So I'd like to introduce this session and to remind everybody that it is very likely that we would be working from unsurrendered Indigenous land, and that this fact has implications. So this is our first session in this webinar series, and we're dealing with the way technology deploys metaphors. We have 3 sensational papers, and we will start with Robyn Ferrell's paper, and then we move on with Tim Strom, and then Cassandra Steer and Cait Storr would have the last.
Fiona's here too.
The last word without before we open the floor for interventions. So, Robyn.
Great, thanks, Lorenzo. I hope everyone can hear. I'm reading from the screen here just so that my eyes don't drop too often to a bit of paper. This is a kind of cut down version of one of the arguments that I'm pursuing in a book of mine that's just coming out in December. The book is called Philosophical Essays on Free Stuff, which is an intentional oxymoron. And unfortunately, that title was partly the result of the publisher's will. I wanted to call the whole project just Free Stuff, but we had to compromise. In the book, among other things, I'm exploring ways to write theory in the light of the digital and the kind of disruption of the internet and social media. But of course, I'm a bit of a dinosaur myself. So, I mean, in many ways, I'm trying things out in light of a kind of theoretical legacy that's in post-structuralism. And I'm not sure whether that is familiar to the audience that I'm talking with today, but I've tried to leave out proper names as far as I can, and hopefully foreground more of the ideas. So anyway, to get into it, I've started with a metaphor, and I'm sorry I'm reading, but it's because I've got a text, that I'm trying to talk to. So beginning with a metaphor, in haute couture, the idea of the toile describes the draft of the garment that is produced, first in calico, before risking the special fabric that it will eventually feature. The toile allows the couturier to experiment with the form, vary the shape of pattern pieces, and to try out new ideas. Now, the same can be imagined for the production of thought. The method of fabrication of thought isn't much considered, yet it is these methods and the forms of writing that provide toiles for its expression that are now coming under pressure in the digital age. Patterns like the treatise and the monograph, published in hardback from university presses, which this book will be, might begin to look old-fashioned in the light of new construction methods and materials like the blog, the YouTube channel, the podcast, and the tweet. And just as a footnote to that, I am attempting to redo this book as a podcast after a statutory 6 months, to recognise the questions of copyright. Now, it sometimes seems that discourse is no longer constrained by clear arguments and reasoned positions painstakingly developed. The proliferation of text means perhaps that no one any longer reads closely. There is just too much to read. I think some of us as teachers are frustrated by that aspect of it. And instead, the meme, the parading of associations, and especially the action of images, mobilises conviction. Thus, rhetoric becomes the substance of debate. Rhetoric is foregrounded, the main event now, in cultural, social, and increasingly political domains, and never more so than in challenges to liberal democratic values. These challenges take place rhetorically as scandals of representation, fake news, post-truth, the lies, profanity, and bullying speech of the ideologue, no less than the tendentious lures of the marketer, have become usual methods of articulation. Truth isn't truth, Rudy Giuliani protests. What can he mean by this? But that deceit has entered the political discourse in such a way that to say truth is not to risk being unintelligible, even though it was a shorthand that attracted ridicule. Not only talking heads on television, but people in high office making these kinds of statements to camera is evidence of a crisis in the discourse. When Kellyanne Conway refers to alternative facts, the important thing to take away is that when the White House says this kind of thing, it does not expect to be dismissed as making no sense. No one claims that they misspeak. They are speaking to a sizable audience who hear them as speaking their language. And maybe in the time of the digital, thinking has changed. Critique must change with it. No longer can analysis keep out the force of rhetoric because it is deployed everywhere to run away with the argument. It no longer works to argue facts and points of view in the face of the rhetorical extravagance of Twitter and fake news on Facebook. At the same time, and as a response to this, it has become more pressing than ever to speak truth to power. But perhaps the treatise is no longer working. What is needed to wrest an understanding from the torrent of representations cascading around us in media streaming, and especially in the ungovernable geysers of social media outpouring? Critique must sink or swim in the multiplying public domains dominated by blandishments of the market, the promise of simulation, and the movement of figures, both textual and economic. So now to my second section. What theoretical tools do we have in the critical theory tradition to analyse the productive capacity of metaphor as figure, image, and spacing to grow a world? An image depicts, and a figure is an image that stands for something else. Spacing is more subtle, something you don't see. It is the sequence in which things appear, the forms that wrap them in coherence, which come prearranged as genres, and that is to say, as expectations and even as formulae for rhetorical shape. Now, I propose 3 slogans to provide a metaphorical backstory to the cultural revolution of the internet and the digital, and I outline those on my abstract. The first of these is the famous Heideggerian quote, "Technology is a way of thinking." Martin Heidegger wrote about technology before much of what we live with today came to pass. Like, he obviously doesn't have a smartphone. He is still prescient. Before there is technology, there is a way of thinking. Technology is a way of imagining the world as being there for the taking, defined by an instrumentalism. Before there are machines and devices, there must be the idea of making the world to fit our own ends and finding the means to do it. Instrumental thinking itself becomes a kind of technology. Thinking like that allows us to make things work for us, not just in material terms, but in the way we conceive of worlds, the social, the political, the economic. This instrumental thinking about life is powerful and it takes many forms. Instrumental thinking has a long history before the internet and economic rationalism. Its emergence with technology at the inception of the secular state was observed by Weber, among others. Ironically, Weber, who had so aptly observed the instrumental indefeasibility of bureaucracy as a kind of machine, analysed individual freedom also as beginning from a kind of rationality closely allied to instrumental, as a feeling of freedom associated with actions we are conscious of performing rationally, as he describes it, in the absence of physical and psychic compulsions, vehement affects and accidental disturbances of the clarity of judgment, in which we pursue a clearly conceived end through means. End of quote. It has been pointed out that enormous psychical energies required of the modern urban subject to dwell in this rationalist economy as an employee and as a consumer, and we should add to that as a conformer to modern bureaucracy as well, subject to public health discourses, etc., etc. The habitat overemphasises the conceptual and instrumental at the expense of the affective parts of experience. At the symbolic cultural level, Weber predicts the heightened prestige of economist thinking and the calculative habits of mind associated with the market economy and its related technologies have become inflated in the modern world. And at the psychical level, the investments we make in technological prosthetics, from the smartphone to brand name clothes and shoes, illustrate that this instrumental has its consequences in fetishism and disavowal. So that's technology is a way of thinking. Second slogan, in the future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. Andy Warhol, the pop artist whose large canvases brought to book the fine art feint as distinct from commercial art, saw what mass information systems could do before the internet came online. In the 1960s and 1970s, in The Factory, he experimented with popular culture and declared, in future, everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. This democratising of fame and celebrity suggests everyone gets their moment in the sun. The flip side is that sustaining notoriety and even concentration will be difficult. The internet deals in currency, in things that are here and now. Yesterday's celebrity is already a genre. Where are they now? The former stratification of culture, where the rich and famous, the great and the good were admired from afar, has been greatly modified by the DIY of social media and the dream of going viral, if only with a cat photo. In internet culture, the meme picks out the unit of social meaningfulness, uniquely expressive in a sea of media images that conform from screen gestures and photos to cartoons, video segments, and broadcasts. Importantly, they are images before they are memes. They need to become images to become memes. This is the seed that sows the virtual, the condition of the possibility of a virtual world, of which the internet is just one actualisation. The internet as the materialisation of free association and the systemic deployment of an image logic is key to a teletechnological, that word's there it is, model of creating value. It is through the action of the image that its associations are transmissible and that investments compound and proliferate. Things rendered as images become thinkable as objects of exchange. Memes become bound to a form of cultural transmission that theorists have labelled viral, and which some have gone as far as to describe in terms of an evolutionary metaphor, claiming they evolve via a kind of fitness test. So this making of memes is exemplary of value creation in the era of the internet. The internet is changing culture, and not just by changing how it is displayed and disseminated. The web is changing how culture becomes legible. In doing so, cultural values are being transformed. A new logic is being installed. The way cultural products are created and disseminated is dramatically conditioned by the internet and demonstrates a shift in underlying modes of expression and intelligibility. These new modes carry their own philosophical tendency, one's quite unlike the traditional Enlightenment logic that has driven cultural values in the 19th and 20th centuries. The virtual intensifies the logic of the image. Free association isn't random, it is just unrestrained by ordinary logic processes. Its series connect terms not through narrative, historical, causal or logical consequences, but through likeness, and predominantly visual likeness, that can be played on forward or rewind. This is metaphor in action. What creates value in memes is their likeness. The sequence protects, supports, and promotes their differences into an intelligible whole. Association is propelled by sameness into streams of images in consumer culture. But what cannot be visualised in the overwhelming deluge, the really different, becomes radically invisible. It disappears from the catalogue of the real. The internet serves as a focus for the discussion of metaphor and rhetoric, according to this argument, because it is the real world instantiation of the power of the sign and a literal rendition of it, which I guess I'm suggesting a discussion of metaphor can bring to light. And the third of my slogans, the Gulf War did not take place. So there's the more sombre analysis of Jean Baudrillard's summation that the Gulf War did not take place. This was not a war, but a spectacle devised for mass broadcast. What is seen of this conflict was TV footage from CNN, a simulacrum of war made for television. No fighters, no territory, nor casualties on the ground for the US. The possibility of images taking the place of realities is now propelled by the internet, arguably more so than CNN's coverage of the Gulf War. This is difficult territory for culture to find itself within, behind enemy lines, in a hard place, not finding its material grounding, but imagined in myriad ways by manipulating images. In the idea of the hyperreal, the impact of the image as a substitute for reality is piquantly examined. In Simulacra and Simulations, Baudrillard develops a schema of relations between the image and its referent, the simulation and the simulacra, that casts it as an event of devolving religiosity. The congruence of a sign and its reality was previously guaranteed in the icon, which substituted for the divine only to strengthen its reality as a presence behind the sign, as the analysis goes. But as the faith that the design lay behind it has ebbed away, the image has detached, moving from its status as a copy of the real, a copy of an original, and as a substitute for it, toward being seen as a simulation of it, or even a model for it. And from there, increasingly, the image is an evocation of an absence of referential anchoring that Baudrillard captures in the concept of simulacrum. And just to quote from him here, abstraction today is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror, or the concept. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. End of quote. The image no longer gestures toward its reality. Instead, it creates its own reality stream as in the televising of the Gulf War, which Baudrillard saw as no longer a record of a terrestrial conflict, but instead as a spectacle conceived for televiewing, and we should say by a very particular audience. No casualties, no territories or fighters lost, no blood, merely trace of fire flying across the night sky over an archetypal metropolis. Oh, gotta breathe every now and then. Finally, final section. Heidegger also said the origin of technology is nothing technological. The conceptual origin of technology is the means-ends logic, but it is also the reification of opposition, the conceptual binary of the on and the off. Judgments proliferate in a digitized world that uses layers of these switches, on, off, up, down, black, white, good, bad, right, wrong, spawned into whole networks of values in which we are required to live. Swipe right or left. It happens with discourse as much as with material code. The automated thinking of binaries culminates in algorithms that risk taking thought, its burden and its opportunity from us. Artificial intelligence emerges from the binary code as a kind of automation of judgment, a thousand tiny choices made by the program programmed into the algorithm. And actually, in the exponential automation of self-learning artificial intelligence, it is as if a thousand tiny tendencies to judge have been pre-programmed. Take as an example the automation of the stock market, the automation of the production of economic value through the tireless operation of algorithms enabled globalised production and a system of world trade that made whole populations wealthier. It also produced a disaster as large as the global financial crisis. That the judgment to buy, to sell was automated was part of the perfect storm. The digitising of the financial world and indeed of the whole economic habitat had come about through weaponising the binary code in algorithms. The algorithm is the network of completely digital forms, automated value judgments that turn themselves on and off, and which at scale escalated the catastrophe. The algorithm is the converse of free thought, but binary is critiqued by Derrida as itself a kind of rhetorical device. The opposition, as a device, drives thought like a kind of machine for making meaning and establishing value. But what is constructed can be deconstructed. So finally, as we meet, a presidential election decides if Donald Trump will win a second term, while Brexit comes into effect with or without Britain and the EU having come to terms. But both events are now inundated by the swell of the COVID-19 pandemic across the world. Its automated action demonstrates the power of the viral as a kind of non-thought. A misdemeanour in one small point on the globe linked to the uneasy proximity of the modern and natural world and amplified by misjudgment, forces the issue upon us all of the material supports of our digital realms. This sudden devastation is giving the global a wholly unanticipated task for the decades to come, to rebuild and perhaps to refashion that which we value, and to deploy the metaphors that might bring that about. Thank you.
Oh. Thank you. Thank you, Robyn. We are now moving on to Tim. Tim is presenting on spider boats, Crow Frontier, cybernetic surveillance, and all of the above. Tim.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in wherever in the world you are. I happen to be in the hills behind Coffs Harbour in North New South Wales, where it's really quite hot. It doesn't look that way where Lorenzo is at the moment, judging by the jacket. Anyway, the presentation that I'll give today also has a couple of good crossovers with the last one. It also draws on the legacy of critical theory, albeit not in a post-structuralist way, more in a way that draws on the levels of abstraction argument that have been put forward by several generations of thinkers associated with ARENA. And it's not exactly a paper, it's more drawing from a couple of different things that I've been working on and putting it together in a speedier, more provocative way that's hopefully better suited to this strange mediated form. Anyway, as is well known and discussed, one of the essential functions of metaphor is to explain something abstract in terms of something concrete. Lakoff and Johnson, they mention that in their influential formulation of metaphor, where they say it's part of human nature, that it stems from our embodied experiences in the world, and that they structure our interpretation of reality occurring in the fundamental processes of meaning making, which is to say the domain of culture, which of course is intimately connected with ecologies and economies and politics and all of that in the broader social field, all of that within nature. But explaining something abstract through something concrete is particularly important when describing computing machines, because they are absurdly abstract, both in terms of their hardware and software, and the slippery line that dichotomy doesn't go into. For instance, if you consider a web browser, web browsers have between 6 and 10 million lines of code that run in the background to make them happen. That's a lot. A million lines of code, if printed, it would be about 18,000 pages of text, which is to say about 14 copies of War and Peace. And that's 1 million, not 6 to 10 million, which would be what, 100 up to 140 War and Pieces. And that's just for a single application, just a web browser, not the operating system that in which it runs, and let alone the vast weave of abstractions beyond any single computer, the regimes of interoperability and the different protocols that govern the entire networking of that allows things like the internet to even occur in the first place. And so on the code side of it, one thing I think that's not emphasized enough is that they are code and software, they're decidedly material. They're a construct, the product of human labor, often highly exploited labor, embedded within networks of physical computing machines. And the software is material, but in such a way that it's drawn away from the everyday. It's drawn away from our phenomenological experiences in the world. It's abstract by its very nature. So a particular condensation of social relations and practices, but occurring through machines that are deeply alien to how most people live in the world. And what's more, the actual physicality of machines, like this device that I'm talking at the moment, is of course an intricate combination of plastics, metals, rare earth minerals, silicons, and electricity, which we can just spray the label smart in front of as some kind of metaphor or euphemism or marketing slogan in order to actually not think through how strange these technologies really are in a lot of ways. And the materiality of them is very, very real. One little fact I like to cite in such context is it's little known that streaming 1 hour of high definition video consumes about the same amount of energy as running a refrigerator for 2 weeks. And so if you think at the moment how many people are on Netflix benders, amongst other things, there's a huge, tremendous carbon footprint of the internet. Indeed, you could probably, it'll be difficult, but you could figure out how much carbon was released by transmitting my smiling, real-time audio-visual face to be delivered to you, wherever you happen to be in the world. In short, a tremendous amount of electricity is used to transmit audio-visual material around the planet, let alone all of the energy and resources and pollution that goes into fabricating the hardware, which of course the COVID-19 crisis is merely intensifying something that was already underlying. It's estimated that by 2030, communication technology machines will consume half of all electricity globally. So then when you think of the disembodied metaphor of the cloud, which of course this Zoom's entire platform is based through, that metaphor is entirely nebulous, yet the recomposition of the Earth's atmosphere by those techno-scientific machines is entirely concrete. Anyway, suffice to say, there's absurd amount of complexity in network computing machines. So what do metaphors do in there? They function as a way of coping with terrible abstractions to make them seem less of apparatuses of alienation. And yeah, this is looking at abstraction as a social and material process, which is one of the sort of core theoretical interventions from which I'm speaking. Because metaphors in this instance, they can try to make something hideously abstract seem more comprehensible. And there's a lot of mechanical metaphors that are bound up in software. Like software, it can launch like a rocket, it can crash like a rocket, it uses engines and drivers, and there's various mechanical metaphors that sort of arc back to an older era that was a bit more understandable. In the 1970s, when computers began to move out of the military scientific domain and became more mainstream, one of the ways that they could do that was through the development of graphical user interfaces. And when they were being designed, the people who began doing that, they used a number of everyday objects and concepts to try to represent underlying facets of computing. And they drew very heavily on a bureaucratic imagination. The computer was conceived as a desktop made up of windows with a hierarchy of folders in which you could store your files or scroll through your documents, check your mail, and so on and so forth. Highly bureaucratic thinking, like the language of administration, was put in it very strongly. And this occurred not only through language in that sense, but also through the visuals, which are of course crucial to trying to understand computing machines more generally. Like not only simple things like the little envelope that represents your mail icon. For instance, you can have a look around your Zoom screen interface at the moment, right? There's the mute button, have a look at it, and the little red thing, it's got what looks to be an old-fashioned ribbon microphone as the mute button. Or if you look at the camera button, it's this like boxy little video camera that's presumably has a cassette of film in there or something obsolete. In that instance, those icons function as like relics from a more embodied past, as visual metaphors that will obscure the actual abstractions involved. All of this thus far is something of a preamble to try to get towards discussing the recurrent colonial and extractive metaphors that reveal the power structures that have animated cybernetic capitalism and how they have been and continue to be bound up with its extensive and intensive expansion. Cybernetic capitalism has its roots in the military-industrial complexes, specifically the American one, largely, in World War II, where the term cybernetics was first coined by Norbert Wiener, which drew on a Greek word meaning good at steering, as in like off a ship, as opposed to in the context that he was putting it in. And he defined cybernetics as the science of control and communication between people and machines. And so it's a very fertile one for understanding the massive qualitative transformations that began occurring or with the splitting of the bomb and the history that's rolled on since then. In addition to the early formulations of cybernetics, another important document at that time was published in 1945 by Vannevar Bush. It was a presidential report called Science, the Endless Frontier. And it was incredibly influential, and it was seeking to map out the potentialities of a post-war military-led research, scientific research. And it's, of course, describing science as an endless frontier. It draws on a long colonial history of science imagery that goes back to characters like Francis Bacon at the beginning of capitalist modernity through. And in this instance, it was a colonial metaphor, but not only a metaphor, it very quickly became quite literally colonial, with a lot of the cutting edges of technoscience and surveillance and computing control actually playing out in the margins and the edges of expanding empires around the world. To focus in on a more specific moment, back in 1998, Google's co-founders, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, created their first search engine, which was made, in their words, in an effort to bring order to the web. And they wanted to impose order on the web through surveying the World Wide Web and plotting where the hyperlinks are, where they point to, and thus to create a vast data map of the abstract terrain of the web. Mapping is a very potent metaphor for abstraction, perhaps the master metaphor for abstraction processes. And it's has strong and across the last 500 years of history, there's been strong connections between colonial surveys and surveillance. In fact, those two concepts, the survey, the colonial land survey, and surveillance are deeply connected. Even the formulations of the words quite similar. Like survey came from sur, meaning above, as opposed to like sub, below, and veer, meaning see, means to see from above, to watch over, to look down at something in order to project control on top of it, which is basically exactly what surveillance does in its most simple way. And survey, it first came into the English language just at the dawn of capitalist modernity, slightly before 1492 and the rise of global empires and whatnot. And at that point, survey meant first the cartographic means to determine the boundaries of private property, being intimately bound up with the enclosure of the commons. And so it was to survey, to look down from, to view something from a commanding height, to watch over it in order to control it. And the colonial survey preceded and prefigured surveillance in so many ways. I've gone into this in quite a bit of detail elsewhere, so I'm going to skip over it pretty quickly now. And jumping back to 1998, where when Google went about surveying the web, they did so by creating a number of programs, little pieces of software that they called crawlers. Also, they called them bots, being short for robot, or sometimes spiders or variations thereof. But these crawlers, bots, spiders, they're all metaphors that point to tiny little bits of programming that conduct automated surveillance on the web. They're designed to survey, index, abstract, and enclose. The main crawlers that the tech titan uses are called Google bots. And there's two of these. They're a twinned pair of spider bots. They have both a desktop and a smartphone iteration, which each make their surveys based on their respective computing machines, mobile or otherwise. And the Google bots, they are extended by about a dozen or so other crawlers that are constantly crawling over the web and weaving this map of the web. That includes things like AdBot, AdSense, FeedFetcher, specific ones for video, for news, and so on. And so those bots are constantly crawling over the web, investigating everything and bringing its insights back to Google, where it weaves it into a giant map of the internet. And so to do that, a lot of the traffic on the internet is not human. In fact, most of it's bots. It was in 2016 that the threshold was passed, where there were now more than 50% of the internet traffic, total internet traffic, was made of bots, not human activity. And that's only intensified since. And so there's many institutions that release crawlers on the web, but Google are definitely the biggest. So spilling forth from Google's server hive structures, their spider bots figuratively crawl through the internet, extracting surveillance data and processing it into the weave of a map web, which simplifies and overlays the World Wide Web. And that map web that Google creates, that's how their search engine operates. It doesn't search the internet, it searches the map of it. And that's where they get their control and source of immense social power. So whenever someone Googles, to use the verb form of the corporation's name, which is of course itself a metaphor, the search engine's algorithms operate on the map web, thereby facilitating a person's ability to navigate through cyberspace, as well as the corporation's ability to extract profit and project power over the cybernetically reconstituted world. Technical names like crawler, spider, and bot all seem to make these software functions through metaphor seem more understandable, as opposed to with metaphor functioning to see something more abstract through something more concrete. But unlike an actual spider or popular imagination of a robot, they're fundamentally disembodied. They communicate as logical functions expressed in code, ultimately electricity, definitely not immaterial, but very disembodied, very drawn away from everyday experience, and thus in tension with Lakoff's understanding of metaphor as coming from experience. And then if there's something that's fundamentally beyond that, like how does meaning deal with it? Of course, you can communicate with the bots. I mean, the product of human labor. For instance, if you wanted to verify that the bots crawling over your website is an actual Google bot, you can do that, because of course there's a whole industry of people faking Google bots to try to get into websites and do all sorts of malicious things. So there's ways that you can communicate with it, but to do so you must speak in its language. For instance, to pick a random website, say the Institute for Post-Colonial Studies website, if it wanted to confirm a potential Google bot's true identity, they could do so using a specific bit of code, which could be put in the background of the website. I've written it out by hand here, which I realize is very stupid for code, because it doesn't help anyone when written by hand. I've just put it there because it's a tiny little function, but you can see how alien such things is to the majority of people. It's just a scroll of numbers and letters. Makes sense, a complete logical function, but an arcane language, utterly alien to the majority of people on the planet. And it's through functions like that that you have to communicate with it. It shows the hegemony of it. You have to speak its language in order to communicate with it. And so as Google and other companies like it send forth all of these spider bots to crawl through cyberspace, their expansion follows the dictates of the crawl frontier, which is a very, I think, creepy and colonial metaphor that refers to the encoded logic of how the spider bots are to expand and process whatever they encounter. And as they go, the various bots and crawlers expand the crawl frontier, as they go, they engage in scraping, which is a rather, not visceral, rather scratchy kind of metaphor for extracting data from websites, and not just websites. So, with that scraping being a key moment in data mining and the ability to extract patterns and knowledge from large data sets. So of course, that being central to how Google and all of the big tech companies function. And it goes well beyond the web too. If you think about, I don't know, like a Google Street View or its images or satellites or this or that, and there's many, many ways that it goes far beyond its origins on the web. Again, the recurrent colonial and extractive metaphors in computer sciences can be seen as revealing of the power structures that have sponsored and enabled their development, and that they work to intensify. So there's a feedback loop between them within cybernetic capitalism to try to tighten its weave of social control through this most abstracted means. The spider bots, as they go, they are programmed to carry out little enclosure movements. For the map web that they spin is, of course, Google's private property. People can be granted access to it at a level, like you can go and search for something, but beyond that, the actual map web is inaccessible. It's guarded up in the tech titans' gargantuan black box. You can pay money to advertise better or to get web analytics or things like that. You may be able to get greater insights from Google, but nevertheless, the cyber capitalist corporation firmly controls the means of abstraction.
Tim.
Yeah.
This is compelling. I hate to interrupt you, but we have 15 minutes for each speaker.
15? I thought it was 20.
Anyway.
Oh, sorry.
Please go on.
Okay, sorry, my mistake. I thought it was 20. I messed that up.
Even
okay,
then, go ahead.
Okay, sure. I'll just contract the last bit. I don't have much to go anyway. Okay, for instance, right now, right, using Zoom. Zoom, they are, of course, data mining our digitized images. They employ have recently hired a bunch of people who are experts in artificial intelligence powered facial recognition technology, who look to employ sentiment, emotional sentiment analysis algorithms, where they will look at images of all of us, looking for, I don't know, pupil dilations or involuntary grimaces. So it's fair to say that there are software spiders metaphorically crawling, or even literally crawling, over our digitized images, with other bots, of course, listening in and surveilling every word that's said, looking for opportunities to update their dossiers that they assemble on people in order to sell that to advertisers and manipulators. The whole world of targeted advertising and its promises of incredible wealth and power. Zoom have not cracked this yet, but you can be sure that they're definitely trying to. So then any of the words that you say around such surveillance systems, like, I don't know, new shoes, swing vote, health insurance, white genocide, whatever, if they're captured by the surveillance, they could end up being used to trigger automated advertising and cybernetic manipulations that then could thrust me into various feedback loops and filter bubbles. Again, on Zoom, not yet, but if you have a smartphone around you, definitely there. So to wrap up, metaphor can be used as ways to cope with abstractions. Highly technical ones like bots on the crawl frontier and data mining and whatnot, those ones are understood by very few people, whereas something like a search, like Google is a search engine, you click the search button, it itself is an incredible concentration of these dynamics, like the little magnifying glass in the fake blue button. And I mean, it's a fake button because it seeks to replicate the older, obsolete mechanical button, like the button that you push that physically pushes the tape head into the reader. In Google's case, it's got this little magnifying glass, which is a relic from many moons ago. And when you click on its button, the little shadow effect comes around it. So it looks as if you can actually push it in and get a sense of direct mechanical control over it. But that itself is an illusion, replaced by metaphors and illusions that seek to cover up these abstractions. This kind of thinking has cascading implications across technology, politics, subjectivity, ontology, meaning making, and so forth, where metaphors are used to obscure abstractions and make people feel less alienated by the apparatuses that have colonized so much of everyday life. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. That's incredible. I'm sure we'll all talk about this later on. Now we have a third paper by Cassandra Steer and Cait Storr. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I may actually have to leave at past. I might be able to stretch it a little bit, but that was absolutely fascinating, Tim. I want to read what you're writing. Cait and I are talking about the metaphor, well, the many metaphors of colonization in space. So I'm doing that as a space law expert, and she's coming at it as a colonial history expert. And the reason we wanted to do this together is because we started some conversations following some space law panels, online panels, where it became very clear that there's not enough of this cross-disciplinary conversation happening. So I've been learning an immense amount from attending these sessions. Most of you speak from a discipline that is not at all mine, but I think that's where the conversation between Cait and I is truly valuable. It's an experimental thing. We haven't written a paper yet. We want to turn this into a paper and a podcast and all sorts of those other kinds of media that Robyn was talking about. But the reason that this is relevant is because space mining in particular, but certainly our human expansion into space, is a very real thing. It's no longer a matter of science fiction. If you take any notice of what's going on in space, just this week it was announced that Australia is one of 7 countries that entered into a bilateral agreement with the US called an Artemis Accord. So the Artemis program is the US's program to return astronauts to the moon for the first time since the 1970s. Within the next 4 years is the plan. And also to start mining resources on the moon and potentially on asteroids. And the reason that is exciting but also highly contentious and has a lot to do with this idea of colonization of space is because our space law framework is we have the 4 core space treaties that are a product of the Cold War. They were all negotiated and signed during the 1950s and 60s at the height of the Cold War, when the Soviets and the US were the main parties active in space. Of course, the other post-World War II powers, the colonizing powers, were very quickly active in space and were very supportive of, in particular, the Outer Space Treaty, the first of those core treaties. And Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, despite the fact that it was a product of the Cold War, managed to express something of the concern of smaller countries, essentially those being colonized, of the need of guaranteeing a right of access to space. So Article 1 states that the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and all other celestial bodies, all natural bodies in space, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development. So the colonized countries really making sure that their interests were represented. And the exploration and use of outer space shall be the province of all mankind. I've written an entirely different piece that is soon to be published, which is a feminist analysis of space law and the impact of that, the use of that language. But that's a side note. The fact that space is meant to be the province of all mankind and not just the province of those with the greater technological wherewithal is highlighted also in Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which says that space is not subject to appropriation. States cannot claim sovereignty nor appropriation by any other means. And yet, this left the door open as to what that means for private property rights over extracted resources. Obviously, it wasn't the main concern at the time during the Cold War. That really was about ensuring that no state could become a single dominant power in space. But there's a huge debate now that we have many, many more commercial actors in space than we do states. And we have commercial actors pushing the boundaries of technology and therefore requiring of states that they put laws in place that protect what they want to do in space, requiring of countries to put those laws in place. One other small piece or very important piece in terms of the legal framework is there is a fifth space treaty which is not seen as one of the core treaties because it only has 18 signatories. The other treaties have in the hundreds. It's called the Moon Agreement. It was negotiated in 1979 and it was mostly the colonized states. The majority of those small number of states are South American or the Philippines or Morocco, who wanted to put in place a regime that echoed a little bit the regime that was being developed for the Law of the Sea, which Cait is going to talk more about, to ensure that if these kinds of activities, commercial activities, do take place in future in space, there should be an international multilateral legal regime put in place to ensure that all states can benefit from those activities and to ensure that it isn't just who gets in first. Australia, along with the Netherlands and Austria, are the only three, well, Australia was colonized, of course, but it wasn't colonized as recently as these other countries were. The only three kind of Western countries that signed on to this treaty, and Australia is now the only party that is a state that is a party to the Moon Agreement that is also now signed on to these Artemis Accords, in which the US asserts and determines that there is a right to space mining under international law. So it's very contentious. So the reason that background is important is because, you know, I'm sure we all think about space as a frontier. It's the way it's described all the time. You know, the Star Trek series, space, the final frontier. But it's about stirring the frontier mindset, trying to get excitement for these commercial companies that are pushing these boundaries. The desire to conquer, to rule, to be a superior race. In fact, the US itself, both the government and many US companies, use the language of it is their manifest destiny. So they will say it is humankind's manifest destiny to colonize space, to expand into space, to colonize planets in the future. But they're quite often talking about really supporting the interests of American companies in particular. And so that's exactly the language that was used to justify the expansion into the western part of what is now the United States, the manifest destiny of the white settlers to expand into these apparently unpopulated areas. So colonization of space, in the future of Mars, but in the more I guess the closer future, the more immediate future, there will be colonization of the moon. This is going to happen in the next decade, perhaps the next 2 decades, but very much in our new future. And the colonization of our orbits. So we are thoroughly dependent on space-based technologies for pretty much every aspect of our 21st century lives. Internet, telecommunications, navigation, climate tracking bushfires, everything that we need to do. All of that is based on satellites, and we are crowding those orbits, and there is a desire to colonize those orbits, even though the Outer Space Treaty says no state can claim sovereignty in space. By having more the dominance of the US in particular, and US companies, of those very valuable orbits is itself a kind of colonization without being a legal appropriation. And this is the language that's used constantly to romanticize and justify activities of companies like Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin. So they're always talking about their visions of humanity, you know, our manifest destiny to expand and become an interplanetary species. But it is romanticizing their commercial activities and their colonization. They are masculinist, they're imperialist, and they're all about commercial dominance, and specifically US commercial dominance. And my argument has been, and I've written a couple of pieces where I've stated, because this mirrors the history of colonialism, that's why we should stop calling it colonialism. We should stop referring to space as a frontier. We should stop talking about colonizing Mars. We should use a different language because we should have a different mindset. And so the current debate on the legality of space mining, which is absolutely the hot issue right now in space law and in international law, it's being propelled by the colonialism metaphor and this manifest destiny mindset. And rather than being propelled by the mindset of the province of all humankind, which is the very basis of the Outer Space Treaty. And it's not being fueled by a sustainability mindset, despite the UN having adopted last year 21 guidelines on the long-term sustainability of outer space, with a concern for how our activities are impacting the environment that we're so dependent on. It matters because our dependence on space matters, and it's already a very unequal playing field in terms of access to the space economy and access to its benefits. So I've always argued we should stop using that language, that metaphor, because of the damage it does. And then I started talking with Cait, who has managed to start to convince me otherwise. So I hand it over to you, Cait.
Oh, brilliant.
All right, thanks, Cass. Okay, yeah, so it's my contention that it is short-sighted to regard the private space industry as mere distraction or deflection from the daunting global challenges of the day. Extreme wealth inequality, climate change agreements falter, and international collaboration itself is increasingly discredited. The private space industry is better understood as part of a conservative counter-response to those challenges. And that counter-response places its faith not in state-driven international agreement-making, but in capitalist solutions to crisis. Economic growth and technological development are the cardinal virtues, and degrowth and redistribution are not to be countenanced. Amazon founder Jeff Bezos is a key driver of that counter-response. In his evangelizing about the private space industry, Bezos routinely replays the spatial and temporal dimensions of what Kilgore has described as astrofuturism. For Kilgore, astrofuturism is a utopian amalgam of European imperialism and liberalism that developed in the post-war United States. It is marked by a spatial fantasy of unlimited geographic expansion, to quote, extending the 19th century notion that conquest and empire are the logical modus operandi of any progressive civilization. Now, these astrofuturist narratives around space mining align closely with techno-utopian narratives around climate change mitigation. Space entrepreneurs frequently greenwash their ventures. They point to the material dependency of renewable energy infrastructure, and in particular battery storage, on rare earth metal supply. A clean energy future on Earth, so the rhetoric goes, will necessitate off-Earth resource extraction. In Bezos's world, the only option to planetary limits is to colonize space, a domain, as he calls it, of unlimited resources. Now, these astrofuturist narratives distract from historical fact. While the hard technologies that make the space industry possible are indeed new, the legal technologies are not. Understanding the reinvigoration of a 21st century project of extraterritorial extractivism laced with an unabashed colonial imaginary requires clear-eyed engagement with the history of international law. Comparable periods of resource-driven jurisdictional expansion include the so-called scramble for Africa during the high imperialism of the late 1880s, and diplomatic conflict over the international seabed and the Antarctic during the Cold War in the 1950s and 1960s. Cass was talking a little bit about that framework, and although it is forgotten as such, the framework of international space law was a pivotal debate during the decolonisation movements of the late 1950s through to the 1970s. While the Outer Space Treaty prohibited sovereign appropriation, it left the door open for private proprietary claims. This permissive silence on the question of private ownership and control over minerals and metals refigured space as a new frontier for corporate resource extraction in the late 1960s and 1970s. Moreover, it did so for both decolonising and colonial states at precisely the same time as the status of property rights in natural resources derived from colonial law came to dominate the anti-colonial agenda. So for former colonial states, space represented a new field of resource extraction free from the risk of post-independence nationalisation. And for decolonising states, the possibility of extraterritorial resource rights represented an opportunity for post-independence economic development. Now, the notion of the province of all mankind, which Cass was talking about earlier, sustains both these contradictory interpretations, which largely explains its original adoption. Subsequent attempts within the UN framework to address the regulation of space resource extraction ended in diplomatic failure. Cass was talking about the Moon Agreement before. So the post-2001 chapter in the development of the private space industry is part of the global reinvigoration of that decolonisation debate. The USA has always rejected the Moon Agreement and the idea that space is the global commons, and this year moved to replace it with the Artemis Accords. So how do we understand all of this? The private space industry lends itself to seemingly straightforward Marxist analysis as yet another illustration of the inherently expansionist logic of capitalism. The advent of the industry conforms, at least in part, to contemporary understandings of primitive accumulation as an ongoing process. And more specifically, to what David Harvey described as the spatial fix to capitalism's crisis tendencies, and in particular, the crisis of capital over accumulation. From this perspective, the appeal of the private space industry to platform entrepreneurs like Bezos and Elon Musk is obvious. As individuals, they represent extreme examples of capital over accumulation and occupied determinative roles in the production of online space in the 1990s and 2000s. Where the advent of extractive activity in space signals a need for elaboration of understandings of the spatial fix is in the seeming absence of pre-existing labour power or productive capacity in the new space being produced. The private space industry appears misleadingly to not enliven the same relations of labour exploitation that produced the concentrations of capital that have made it possible. It is precisely, to my mind, this apparent absence of a human subject of exploitation that has enabled the space industry to embrace the idiom of colonisation as readily as it has the idiom of common benefits. So the risk in dismissing the revalorisation of colonial rhetoric as merely metaphorical are numerous. The first risk is a tacit exoneration of the global labour relations that have resulted in such extreme capital overaccumulation in the first place. The labour practices of Amazon, for example, are notorious. A second risk is the prospective entrenchment of those global labour relations into the economy of any scaled industry of space resource extraction, and therefore into any post-fossil fuel energy market that depends on that extractive activity. A third risk is the renovation of a much older conservative discourse of environmental conservation that, as Richard Grove argued, has long accompanied European imperialism. As space entrepreneurs demonstrate with their greenwashing strategies, conservational discourses work to displace extractive activity, not to prevent it. The rhetorical innovation space entrepreneurs make is to ramp up this spatial displacement of extractive activity to planetary scale. They are, as Bezos claims, colonising space to benefit Earth. So to conclude, space colonisation, I argue, needs to be recognised for what it is, a 21st century iteration of corporate-driven jurisdictional expansion. Dismissing this phenomenon as a sideshow to the real event of global environmental and economic crisis misses the point. It prevents analysis of a coalescing market-driven response to that crisis grounded in techno-utopian and astrofuturist ideology. That response seeks not to dismantle the historical relations of environmental and labour exploitation that have produced this crisis, but to entrench them in a post-fossil fuel future. And I'll leave it there.
So if I can just bookend with one final small comment, is that everything in Cait's very thorough analysis has been exactly my shared concern. It's just that I've come at it with the notion that if we change the language, we can change the reality, which is part of my feminist analysis of space law. So if we can stop calling it colonialism and stop calling it a space frontier, maybe we can change the mindset. But I've been actually quite convinced by Cait's point, which is just by calling it something different, you don't deny its existence, and in fact, you might even be giving it more power. So I leave it at that.
Thank you, Cassandra and Cait and everyone else. Look, we have about just over 20 minutes for a conversation, and I really look forward to this. This is taking off, to use a metaphor, apt for this week's topic. I just wanted to say before allowing Des to issue his question. I wanted to say that space must be the province of all mankind has already inbuilt in it a colonial foundation, because to be a province, you must be an area subjected to a metropole. I grew up in an imperial province. I know about it. So anyway, Des.
Look, I just thought that's our problem, you see. Sorry, I'm just trying to fix up the...
Is that any better?
No, you need to turn off your mic. It's not your Zoom mic.
In the meantime, please write down.
We're good.
I think you're right.
I think we're right. Sorry about that. Sorry. Okay. I think that's all good. So listen, those were really amazing papers. I think that's the best collection of papers that I've heard in any seminar anywhere, and the way in which they all spoke to each other and argued amongst each other was fantastic. So my question is in a way about that argument, and there were many arguments going on in those papers, including an argument of the third paper in and amongst itself, which I think was particularly fantastic. But it seemed to me that both Robyn and Tim's analysis of image metaphor and the modern world were compelling, but I felt like they were actually pulling in different directions. So on the one hand, it seemed like Robyn's story in a way was that metaphor is a process of dematerialization of the real, right? Basically a dematerialization. Whereas Tim's argument seemed to be that metaphor was a process of rematerialization of the abstract. So I'm just wondering, how do those two ideas relate to each other? Do we think about how they might speak to each other? Is it a disagreement? Is it something else?
Robyn, would you like to answer to this, and then Tim, just to stick with the original order?
Yeah, I actually don't know whether the distinction maps that directly onto the material. I mean, I think one of the things that's very interesting and implicit in the notion of the metaphorical is its relation to the material, because I was also attempting to glance at the ways in which it's productive, but the question is of what, I suppose. I mean, the distinction between a dematerialized and a materialized realm seems to be broken down, certainly from what Tim was explaining in that incredibly graphic description, Tim, that you gave of a kind of space that's encrypted for us with other kinds of metaphor. I mean, so trying to pin down the ways in which that could be described as material, that that's kind of set that web that you brought to life with the spider bots, and, you know, I mean, an amazing metaphoric space, but also, of course, as you point out, a reality embodied in electricity and logical function, very far from its metaphorical dress. To my mind, the question of what sort of material is brought to life from metaphor, actually there is another metaphor to do it, but what kind of materiality results from metaphor's production is very important and interesting. And I'm not quite sure that would just take a whole lot of other discussion, it seems to me, to pin to, you know, and a series of examples like the ones that Tim was providing, which I thought were really evocative, Tim. Just amazingly the layering there of not even a kind of conspiratorial story about those metaphors, but something really interesting about their imaginaries powering those spaces. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, to arc back to a comment that you made last week, Lorenzo, about the monsters that we were discussing, whether we live in an age of monsters or an age of conspiracies. And none of what I discussed is conspiratorial in the fake, like kooky conspiracy sort of way, but it's hidden, it's obscured. And so the monsters today are like hidden in plain sight in the little thing that carries around in our pocket and we look at first thing in the morning and all of that. So it's kind of both. And I guess one way to get to Des's question about how these processes could be related, are they pulling in different directions? Yeah, they definitely are. There's some big contradictions out there. Perhaps one way to begin to approach such contradictions and be able to test their limits and see them for what they are could be through looking at them as a number of different levels. On the most abstract level, you have the actual functioning of the technological machines themselves and their abstracted materiality and the minerals and whatnot that compose them and all of that, which is the province of the technosciences, and it's strongly disembodied. And then when you have the meaning-making subjects, like beings like us, it starts with the understanding of metaphor that we've been discussing, starts from the body as something that actually occurs to try to make sense of everyday experience. So then on the level of a body, of an individual person trying to make things, the concept of search makes sense. We all search for things, and on a physical embodied sense, it makes sense. And then even simpler technological abstractions from it, such as a magnifying glass. I mean, to get a glass, you need the lens grinders, you need all sorts of technological artifacts in place for that to come into being, and the kind of culture to bring that about. But there's a number of different levels. And I guess these days we're sort of caught in this because on one hand, we're very localized beings with our limited sets of phenomenological experiences and so on and so forth. And yet confronted with this globally all-consuming, incredibly abstract structure. So I guess having an analytic approach that can methodologically pry apart the more embodied and the more disembodied, the more using that kind of axis, we can begin to get, and the steps in between it, we can begin to understand how materiality and abstraction are actually bound together in contradictory ways, where something, as things are produced, which is from the Latin meaning bring forth, they are also abstracted, which is from the Latin meaning drawn away. And that, of course, the forces of production have increased over the centuries, likewise, the forces of abstraction, and these are pulling in different directions. I don't know, we can probably go on about this for a long time, but I suspect such a leveling analytic approach would be helpful to try to make sense of these apparent contradictions.
Great. Before allowing others to intervene, I also wanted to say that there is thematic coherence. If you recall, a few weeks back, we were talking about whether the metaphors could be conducive to decolonization, or on the contrary, whether decolonization shouldn't be interfered with metaphors. And so the idea is, does metaphor reveal or conceal? Does metaphor embody or abstract, and so on and so forth? So this is a very organic conversation, and it's very exciting to be involved in this. Anyone else would like to intervene at this point?
Can I just, my name's Aileen Walsh, hello. I'd just like to say something. I was in the previous session with Lorenzo, and my research is on the Aboriginal Deep Past, which may seem very far removed from what you're talking about here in terms of metaphor. But what my research has been about has been the normalisation of psychopathy since the take-up of Christianity by the Romans. And so I think that, you know, the complexity that, that seems to be trying to be grappled with in terms of understanding how, you know, technology is being used, created and used. I think it's interesting and important to note that, like Tim said, so much of our language comes from the Latin. And I think that in terms of mentalities, it's important to appreciate how Roman mentalities of conquest and just, you know, the normal psychopathic behaviour has carried through to the present day, and is not only carried through to the present day, but has been amplified over the centuries, especially since the 15th century, when you know, Europeans started colonising the earth. So since then, of course, that meant that Europe had the money because it was extracting wealth from all the countries that they colonised. And so we have the Enlightenment, and we have the Industrial Revolution, and in the 20th century, we have you know, the beginning of the end. So I think that what may be perceived as contradictions aren't really contradictions if we appreciate that the culture that we're all a part of is inherently psychopathic.
Fair observation. As a descendant of an Etruscan king, I can definitely blame the Romans.
Oh, you sound as if you're being facetious.
No. You know, if you talk empire, you talk Romans. No doubt about that.
I'm terribly sorry that I have to leave, because I actually want to pose a question and then leave before I hear the answer. But maybe I can ask Cait to help me out with what comes up. But the reason I approached Cait about us putting forward a proposal for this whole series is because it is all about metaphor and language and the power that language has. And so I'm really interested in the question that keeps coming back. Does metaphor embody or abstract? Is it creating a reality, or is it only talking about a reality? And can we, by changing metaphor and change language, thereby change reality? Which is kind of the core of the debate between Cait and I guess, which is, you know, on the one hand, I would like to argue, if you change the language of frontier and all of colonialism, then perhaps you can use a language that underscores a different value set, a different mindset, and therefore, optimistically, perhaps in a utopian sense, but it will impact eventually our behavior. That's what feminist legal theory has done to the way that laws are written, by changing the way that laws are written and the way that, what used to be always man was assumed to apply to women when in fact it absolutely didn't. By changing the language of the laws, we've changed the social reality, not to perfection, but it has impacted. And so is there value in changing the metaphor, or do we just then create euphemisms? Do we just come up with, if I'm trying to argue we should come up with a different way of describing human activity in space, does it mean we're just replacing one metaphor with another, or creating a euphemism and leaving power in the same hands? And with that, I have to leave. I'm so sorry. But I want to know the answers. So Cait, I'll come back to you for the answers.
Great. Thank you, Cassandra. It's a very fair question. I have a feeling that we may not be able to answer it with definition.
No, I want you all to solve this now in 1 minute. Okay. Thank you so much. See you on the next one.
Thank you.
Can I say
Lorenzo,
something?
can I? Oh, I'm shouting. Yeah, can I come in and just respond to that?
For sure.
We'll probably, if we were taking the discussion or expanding the discussion in another space, which is itself a metaphor, I mean, we would have to look again at the notion of the relationship between, I mean, that's an opposition, of course, between the material and the textual that's underlying the question, but it seems to be exceeded by the operationally by the examples that are being proposed today in the discussion, both in the cyberspace and in outer space. And I think it's we're kind of in danger of delivering ourselves to a problem that we've already created, right? By making those distinctions in the first place. It does seem to me, for example, that the embodied nature of the stuff that we're talking about doesn't confine ourselves to the human body. I mean, that's an analogy that we naturally make, and because at a certain level the discourse is our own, or our discourses are our own. But there is a sense in which even the spider bot has a body. It's just a different localized set of materialities. And I suppose part of the purpose of tabling COVID-19 there at the end of my discussion was to try and raise in a very condensed way the operations of things that are more than metaphor. The transmitting of that virus across the world has also, of course, transmitted some secondary consequences, which were likely to be more damaging than even those deaths from the actual virus. They're likely to be economic and political upheavals, and yet they are all material effects. So there's just some interesting ways of perhaps the call must, although abstraction is an important metaphor of itself, we also need some specificity, and that's why I think those examples today help to consider the questions too, to take on not greater abstractions and more universal levels of discussion, but these more located kinds of conundrum. Yeah.
That's right. Yes, and of course, abstraction, as Cassandra's and Cait's papers recommend, it's also paralleled by adstraction, which is to bring to the stars, which is what outer space is all about. Des, you had something to say about embodiment and metaphors. Perhaps.
Well, no. Look, I accidentally sent it to you, and then I've sent it to everybody. So I really, just as I noted there on the chat line, that it's possible to think of metaphor exactly as doing those two things at the same time. That is, it is about embodiment, but it works by moving to another realm. Any metaphor, translate, all of those words, all about movement. It's about disassociation. We could say it's through abstraction that it attempts to re-embody something in ways that will communicate differently. So we can see them as pulling in opposite directions, but there's those two forces are, I think, intrinsic to the idea of metaphor.
Yeah.
But I would say that because I've studied, I've researched on the impacts of, the creation of metaphors in language. And Valentin Voloshinov, back in, who was a student of Marx and wrote a fantastic book on language ideologies, Marxist language ideologies. He wrote about how, chains of meaning that belong to words, which is what, of course, we have to deal with and have to cope with in the languages of various forms of colonialisms, that are around the world. So what that means, because words can have multiple meanings, because they are chains of meanings, we always have to have a better understanding of the context, or we're meant to have an understanding of the context that they belong to, that, a specific meaning. And so what that means is that people can not speak the truth by seeming to speak the truth in the languages of colonialisms. Metaphors allow people to off the hook, so to speak. So metaphors are a deliberate creation in languages to obfuscate meaning.
The way I think we may think about metaphors is that they are a device that can translate in one direction and in the opposite direction.
Yeah, like I said, obfuscate.
Yes, absolutely. Or do both simultaneously, in fact, and that's what's dangerous about it all. And yes, I agree. They're not necessarily and not always. Great. We have 4 more minutes. I think we should take advantage.
Just to build on some of the previous points that just came up then, I'd say that language cannot encompass being. I think reducing all of being to language and language games and whatnot can give certain insights on certain levels, but it just can't, it's not enough. There's a much more to it. And I think, yeah, there's long debates within structuralism, post-structuralism, beyond that within critical theory that have gone over this in various ways, but I just don't find it convincing that language can encompass all of it. And yeah, I agree that metaphors they have to abstract, because you're calling it something else. It's like making a connection, which occurs like in the mind between seeing something concrete and then sort of giving it another significance over it. And then those other significance, they can be quite powerful and they can generate new insights and create new levels of meaning and practice and whatnot beyond that. But on itself, yeah, it's not enough. I could go on about this for a long time. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but I guess I'd synthesize it by saying language cannot encompass being. Crucial, but not reducible.
Some would say the other way around, that the language creates a universe. Lisa.
Yes, thank you. And I'll turn my video off because you can see a picture. I'm in Mbantua, Alice Springs. Thanks, everyone. Those were great talks. I have a question for Cait. And I just wanted to reflect on the relationship between literary forms of metaphor and musical expression within movements. The Afrofuturist movement was deeply tied to a whole lot of musical forms, Sun Ra Orchestra and others. And it has a very excessive and deeply layered quality to that free jazz compositional form. And I wondered if experience of engaging sonic experiments which were tied to that movement destabilize any of the hegemonic capitalist, colonial things that you discussed in some part of your talk.
Gosh. Lisa, that's an incredible question with 1 minute to go. I mean, I think that the aesthetics of, particularly the Cold War aesthetics of the space race are an integral part, and were an integral part of the propagandist imperative that underlay the kind of funding element. So I don't think that the movement of capital and the movement of culture can be separated in any real way. I haven't started looking at the cultural resonances of the contemporary space race, but they're obviously there. You know, we're starting to see a lot more cultural product. I haven't looked at the musical side of things, but that's a really interesting question. I haven't started. James Parker is the person to ask. It helps that we're very close friends. Thanks, Des. Yeah. Yeah. So no, it's a question to be thought about, Lisa, but not something that I can answer. Yeah.
It just strikes me that for people who engaged in the movement through its musical forms, there was a sort of an imaginative space that was opened up that might be excessive to some of the other structuring forces. Yeah.
It's one of the reasons why it's crucial to remember that the decolonisation valence of the space race, that it was seen as a field that of cultural expression and of cultural possibility that exceeded colonialism. And, you know, I mean, the Sun Ra example is a really good one, and the fact that Afrofuturism did involve so much of this kind of black space movement as well is certainly something that, yeah, there's work to be done, I think.
Okay, great. I really loved your talks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I think this is one way of concluding our session today. Reminding everybody that we meet again next week. Hopefully, we'll see you all there. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Thanks all.